and welcome to Get the Table, another wrestling roundtable discussion podcast with myself, Adam Wilbourn, and the Dadley Boyz from WhatCulture, here to discuss another burning wrestling issue. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from, for daily wrestling podcasts, where we not only review Raw and SmackDown, but also pay-per-views. We have interviews, roundtable discussions, and a roundup of the week, complete with a bloody good quiz, of course, on WrestleCulture. But as I said, I'm joined by Michael Sudrick and Michael Hamflett. And gents, we are gathered here today to talk about...
Is he getting this over yet?
No.
Yeah.
It's on
what are the comments in?
Don't read them. We are here to talk about the best wrestling whodunits, which has, of course, been caused by someone attempting to murder Roman Reigns on SmackDown Live this week. First of all, what did you make of that segment?
I thought it was absolutely rubbish.
Right.
I mean, right, there's a reason for it. It's not just default cynicism, but, right, the idea of a whodunit is that you're meant to inspire the viewer to ask the question, who done it? Who done it? The question I had following that angle was, why did this look so terrible? Who thought this was a good idea? What was that camera doing up here? Is Roman Reigns hurt or not? How did he not get hurt? It was so poorly crafted, the angle, that the last question on my mind was, who done it? Who done it? Couldn't give a toss, mate. I was more concerned of what am I doing with my life? That was the question.
I kind of had mixed emotions. I was just telling you before we started filming this that initially I thought this is great. This is, and it is arguably a good way to sort of fast track a match in towards SummerSlam. But I was sat there saying, it's very sort of old school. I really enjoyed it. I'm intrigued by it all. And then I was talking to my wife about it and saying, did you see what happened on SmackDown? She's a huge Roman Reigns fan. Someone tried to kill Roman Reigns. And I was explaining through it, and it suddenly hit me that this isn't who ran over Stone Cold Steve Austin. This is who nearly ran over Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Who failed in slightly hurting Roman Reigns. He didn't need to get up and say he was fine. I disagree with everything Michael Sudrick says because I am hooked on this crap. This was absolute garbage, but it's my sort of garbage. Other than the fact that he virtually no-sold it. I don't know why they insisted on putting in that he could just get up and brush it off. Not least when the figure had walked away thinking that the damage was done. Like the looming shadowy figure in the background, who we're pretty sure wasn't Rikishi, but then he was here last week. So we can't rule him out, can we?
No, indeed.
He could have done it for The Rock all over again.
Before we get on to who ran over Stone Cold Steve Austin, what are some of your memories of great wrestling whodunits?
Well, this one gets overlooked, I think, because of recency and the subsequent career paths of both men. But I was a big fan of the Enzo and Cass one. I liked Enzo as the sympathetic goober mate of this giant getting decked until obviously the reveal, in which it goes forgotten how well he acted out the betrayal. Corey Graves as the man who knew things for no adequately explored reason was quite good. And then just revealing the footage to be Cass and Enzo not, even when he was seeing it in front of him, because he was so dense, not really wanting to believe it and the tears forming in his eyes, right as he turns around into a big boot from Cass. I just thought, and as well, WWE are not that great at intrigue anymore. As you pointed out with this one, we've got, a week to pretty much get to the payoff. Even if Sidgwick isn't asking who done it, he would only be not asking it for 7 days because then they've got to pay this off and get to SummerSlam. They actually stretched this out for about a month. They got people to sort of come up with suggestions of who it could be, potential tag feuds, things like that, because surely you would never split Enzo and Cass up until we got to the payoff. I quite liked it.
What I loved about that one is just how, all tag teams virtually exist to break up at some point.
Yeah.
It's not like the old days where you'd expect that act to carry you through decades or whatever, because it's not like a tag team world anymore. So if they do exist to split up, if you take that to one side, you'd think, my God, Big Cass, it was a long time coming. Imagine putting up with Enzo Amore for that amount of time. Not just in the ring, but on the road. You just think, oh God. He was the heel, so you shouldn't sympathise with him. But my God, yes, I would have kicked his head off, Enzo Amore, a lot sooner. So there was a bit of a heft to it. I can understand perfectly why. And it was quite done well in the ring because Enzo Amore, if anything, was just not a weak link. He was pointless. Big Cass could have just chinned these people on his own rather than just watch his mate flail about helplessly, inflicting no damage, then going, right, okay, bang, I'll take your hand. So yeah, it was well done, and I believed it. I believed that somebody wanted to kick Enzo Amore's head off.
The mystery attacker thing is something that WWE has lent on numerous times over the years. Another time I wanted to mention was the attack on Shawn Michaels that led to the match between him and Triple H at SummerSlam 2002. What did you make of that at the time? Or did you think that was a fairly straightforward one?
I got very mixed feelings on that because they couldn't help themselves by doing the turn before they did the turn again. So Triple H...
I rewatched the promo for this and I thought, hang on, they did the let's get ready to suck it pedigree and then went, oh, who attacked Shawn Michaels? I don't know, maybe the bloke who just pedigreed him?
It was one of the first cases of...
Whose sides is he on?
Insecure Triple H having his cake and eating it too and building it to his muscle mass. He was kind of doing that thing where he's like, I'm a bad guy, yeah, and I pedigreed him because we're not friends anymore, but I wouldn't do that. I'm going to find the guy that did that. So he uses that as an excuse to go around pedigreeing other heels. They'd be like, hey, it was me, but I got 3 weeks of pedigreeing out of this. This is a class. Like, he got the best of everything, and then he got the payoff, and then he got the match. It turned out great for Triple H. He would have thought it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people's memories of this are couched in what an incredible blow-off it was.
Yes.
Absolutely incredible. One of the greatest story matches of all time. One of the greatest selling performances of all time. So, yeah, very weird, very convoluted and contrived build, but ultimately it exists as a good thing in retrospect.
Another one we need to talk about outside of WWE is, of course, who is the third man? Bash at the Beach 1996. Arguably the catalyst for so many more, not necessarily whodunits, but who is it, I suppose. What were your memories of that?
My memories of that are Bobby Heenan getting completely unnecessarily buried for acting entirely consistent with his character. People thought, he gave the game away because he famously said, well, whose side is he on? Bobby Heenan's entire commentary career was hilariously doubting the motivations of every single babyface that came like under his auspices. He was absolutely phenomenal at just being such like a misanthrope of a man, a miserable guy who was also obviously completely hilarious, that of course he was going to doubt Hogan's motivation, didn't bat an eyelid. Generally thought, right, okay, well, that's just Heenan back on his bollocks, and I'm entertained by it. Now, 5 seconds later, I'm going to see Hulk Hogan come to the aid because he was Hulk Hogan. He was, like, painted literally in red and yellow forever as just this eternal hero. It was unfathomable that he would turn, and yet it was completely the perfect time for him to turn. It was audacious. It was the best promo he's ever cut in his entire life. Pure pro wrestling, eternal magic for me.
I'll say this without hyperbole. I'm not sure any of us would be sitting here talking about wrestling, doing this job, if that doesn't happen. The butterfly effect of that can be felt to this day in the fact that WWE exists the way it does. Everything that occurred that WWE had to compete against was occurring because of that heel turn. Nash and Hall would have made a difference, but that difference wouldn't have lasted. The industry financially was still struggling, and the graphs were all pointing downwards. Even for WCW, even for a moneyed company that Ted Turner would have tried to protect, the world would have changed around it, and it probably would have gone. It might have swallowed up WWE, and one sense is that you don't think WCW could have sustained WWE in the way that WWE has ultimately sustained all of pro wrestling. I think it genuinely did transform everything. They're not lying when they say that changed everything.
Can I say one more thing on this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's a narrative, a tedious online FDM narrative that's materialised out of all this. Because Bischoff likes to say that Dave Meltzer reported Mabel was the third man, which was an idea that was floated about in The Observer 2 weeks before the event. In the issue, and I've been on the archives, and you can go on the archives as well.
That's a very Conrad thing to do.
Released a week before the event, Dave Meltzer revealed that, yes, in fact, Hulk Hogan will be the third man. Printed, edited, drafted, released, published before that event. That's just one thing I wanted to say. Eric Bischoff.
It was incredibly shocking, though. It's easy to look back now and say, it's wrestling history, obviously. But like you say, that prior to that, you can't think of many times. I certainly, from my sort of childhood, of being genuinely stunned at a face or a heel turn or a reveal as something like that.
It's so transformative, obviously, in terms of how WCW then charged forward with Hogan as a heel, to the extent where even just an image of him, I'll recall it at the time, access to WCW wasn't the easiest in the UK. And I remember a magazine that came out about a month later where he had the black gear on and the black stubble underneath the moustache, and just the visual of that was so striking that my dad, a punished father of a wrestling addict son, was like, well, what's going on there, son? Like, fill me in on why Hogan looks like that now. And I think like a lot of it was drawing eyes in all the ways that Bischoff could have hoped for. And the power of the turn obviously was such that the story exists, and I tend to believe this, that Hogan, he was always going to do it, but they had Sting there ready to be the backup guy if at the very, very last second Hogan just said, I can't do this.
And he could have. He had the claws.
Yeah, he had that there, and Sting was ready to do it. And when now would you set up like a backup guy to have to call an audible like that? When now would anything in wrestling mean as much to a single performer to say, you know what, we need to have a backup guy because I think he might bottle it on the night. I don't think you could even if you said to John Cena, yeah, it's coming up on December, we're going to turn you. Can you attitude adjustment 10 troops, please? We're going to finally get you over. I think Cena would say, yes, boss. If you think it's better business, that's what we'll do. I don't think you'd ever get a situation like that again where you need a spare in supply.
One of WWF's most memorable ones around that sort of time was the higher power, or as the Undertaker put it, the Hauer power. Your memories of that, because there was a lot of speculation on who that could be, and the reveal was shocking, if a little disappointing looking back.
I was crushed.
Memories are, it was like absurd because he'd revealed himself to Steve Austin 1 week earlier. As Raw goes off the air, who is the higher power? And then you think, well, just tell us. Austin, just tell us. Like, you look livid, mate. Can you just tell me who it is? And obviously we have to wait a week to find out why he was so angry. I mean, it was really exciting because everything as it was happening was really exciting. But like a lot of the Attitude Era, it fell away the second you tried to pick it apart. You know, the second you looked back at one chapter of a long Vince Russo story, you're like, well, hang on, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And it just undermines about 6 months of WWE television. The second he pulls that hood back.
The justification was very weak, wasn't it?
Yeah, incredibly weak. I mean,
what were your memories of that time?
Oh, the memories were I had limited access to spoilers. I had no internet in my household at the time. I don't believe I wasn't subscribing to The Observer. I remember I used to listen to the Power Slam hotline because I loved Power Slam magazine. I absolutely loved it. And I don't even know if Finn Martin had that information. So, like, lots of rumours on the playground because it was absolutely massive in school at the time.
Jake the Snake was name being banded around, wasn't he?
Yeah, Jake the Snake and Sid. I knew because it was such a huge, fertile environment of guys jumping ship all over the place, and you know, you didn't know anything about contracts back then, so you just assumed. How old was I at the time? As a 14-year-old kid, that you don't know what contracts are. You just think anyone can just turn up wherever they like.
Ted DiBiase was one because he had money more than Vince McMahon, you were willing to believe, and he brought The Undertaker in the first time. It invited you to sort of fantasy book all these people that could somehow be higher than both Vince McMahon and The Undertaker. You know, it was asking you to believe that like there was these two such powerful storyline figures. Well, he's higher than them. You know, do you look at Ted Turner or something like that? It was wild.
My distinct memories of this were, you know, when you're like young and your dad shows weakness for the first time and you go, oh, hang on, you're meant to be like this big colossal hero. This is the first time I thought, oh, God, Vince, you're crap. Oh, you failed us. You've really failed us, because it did undo all of that narrative in the preceding 6 months, and it just felt desperate. Like, really desperate, like they had no other ideas. But apparently they did, but Vince deemed them not good enough. It just felt like a huge crushing disappointment. The level of hype, it should not go without saying, was gigantic for this. It was all over the show. All over the show was who's the higher power, who's the higher power. And it was just Vince.
It gets sort of brushed under the carpet a little bit because I think the reveal is funny and it's very sort of
iconic.
Attitude Era iconic, isn't it?
Son of a bitch.
Yeah, all that sort of stuff. But I think they even maybe knew that it wasn't going to land as well as they thought, because it's the very same show where Steve Austin reveals that in the week since he's found out it was Vince, rather than going and telling the world, he decided to convince Linda and Stephanie to sell their shares to him, and he comes out in that little red tie and he says, oh, I'm now the owner of it. And rarely would you get such an enormous payoff and that not be how you go off the air. Watch Raw next week. It was like, here's your enormous payoff, but Austin's got one over there, and can we just move on really quickly, please? Because you think you've got to Austin, but he's got one over on you again. That was a waste of your 6 months, isn't it? You know, it's like, get straight on with the story, move on as fast as you can.
One more sort of light-hearted, not necessarily, well, I suppose Whodunit is actually quite appropriate, actually. one that was more lighthearted, but really felt like a missed opportunity for me at the time was who is Vince's illegitimate son? Because we all kind of know the story that was meant to be played out with Mr. Kennedy, obviously the Vince McMahon death storyline.
Curb your enthusiasm.
Indeed.
Very good. Very good.
Does that strike you as something that they could have? It could have been, even though, let's say that the issues with Mr. Kennedy still occur. Surely there's better alternatives to. Isn't it funny that it's Hornswoggle?
The real payoff was staring Vince McMahon right in the face on that very night when the Sandman forgot to get out of the ring when he kicked out the ECW guys. He'd stuck around because he'd missed his cue, and the ring is just left with like Triple H and the Sandman, and they find a way. They have to come up with something last minute. Vince's like, oh, yeah, you get out as well. Like, I watched weeks of Vince McMahon having to work out what he was going to do with the Sandman as his kid. I think that would have been fantastic.
Oh my God, that's total magic. You know how Vince is often compared to Mr. Burns? Like, get rid of those sideburns, Mattingly, and all the rest of it. He's just this demented old bloke who's woefully out of touch with, somehow, inexplicably, a mother who isn't dead. Because they're both very old. Like, have you seen that episode of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns has that illegitimate son?
Yes.
And it's that boorish oaf who had this, like, ridiculous interplay. Imagine that with Vince and the Sandman.
Brilliant, wasn't it?
Oh, they should have done something like that. Not being facetious, like a really, like, incredible odd couple relationship.
Well, Punk has been suggested in the past.
Oh no, not that. Someone who's like worthless, like the Sandman was.
Okay.
Like someone who could have just been like a complete disappointment and disgrace, and then maybe at some point they could have bonded over something daft.
You know, though, to be fair, a bit like how the higher power ends in Austin in a tie. All of that ended with JBL chucking a bin at Hornswoggle. So did the ends justify the means? I think so.
That was one of the most times in my life I've just laughed so much. WrestleMania 24, immortal memory. Stayed up late for it, the whole 9 yards, as I often did. And yeah, he hit a bin lid as hard as he can off Hornswoggle's skull.
From the ring to the floor. Quite the trajectory. So was it all worth it? Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
I've interviewed Hornswoggle and spoken to him about this storyline because I wasn't sure as to how he'd handled it because, like you say, he was just kind of a punchline in it, and yet you speak to him about
as opposed to everything else he did in that.
Well,
company.
indeed, yes, but when you speak to him about it. He said, it's one of his best times in the company because he got to be involved in such a major storyline, even if it was, like you say, just Triple H rolling about on the floor laughing, having been convinced for a while that he was effectively shagging his half sister. It was an incredibly contrived scenario to be in, and they could have done a lot better with it. But like you say, if all parties are happy. And they were,
apart from the audience,
they were sort of backed into the corner. Because do you think the Mr. Kennedy angle would have worked?
Oh, I don't know. I'm always hesitant to add my 2 cents into these what if scenarios because as much as I really liked Kennedy at the time, it felt like he had more of these gaffes in him.
It became apparent to me after all that died down and really started losing his heat after one too many suspensions and the embarrassments in the public and stuff like that, that Vince McMahon was maybe one of his only supporters, and that would have been absolutely fine if he'd have been able to ride that all the way to the top of the company. But as soon as Vince lost faith in him, you saw how nobody else really wanted to help him stay there. Like Randy Orton was effectively the guy that said, "You nearly hurt me there, mate," and he was out the door days later. Shawn Michaels was pretty public about not really enjoying working for him despite really trying to put him over. I don't think Kennedy had allies left. So we know how how Vince McMahon can just flap and he can flail and he can change his mind on an idea. Imagine they've put all that investment into it. He was maybe called Kennedy from the start because maybe something in the back of the mind thought this is where we're going to go with it. And then just like in week 9 or 10 of the storyline, he's like, I don't like you anymore. I completely ran out of patience with you. Like, what would that have done? Might that have been even more, even worse for him? At least he got a couple more years out of work in there compared to this being like his high profile failures were kind of just like unfortunate embarrassments rather than a storyline gone very, very wrong at the worst possible time.
Like he wasn't Hassan. He got like an impact run out of it and all the rest of it.
Right, we've put it off for long enough. I think arguably the greatest wrestling whodunit, or arguably the most memorable in the very least, is of course Who Ran Over Stone Cold Steve Austin. Survivor Series 1999. They already knew he was injured, of course, and they were just going to advertise him.
We didn't.
I was going to swear. I was infuriated because it was the Big Show I didn't merely hate the Big Show. They bloody hated the Big Show. It was obvious all year long that they thought, we'll do this to them, we'll do this to them, that. No, he's crap at everything. So, what can we do? Just have him win the title on the same pay-per-view that we are still advertising Austin.
Knew he was injured, knew they were going to take him off it. You knew they were going to do this, never even mentioned it once. Take us back to Survivor Series 1999 and subsequent events afterwards. What are your abiding memories of that time?
It was like, pretty audacious angle, hit and run. My memories of it, I'll never watch it again. My memories of it, they're quite well executed. Did it look like you got hurt on that car, or am I just imagining this?
It looked
well executed angle. I'm thinking, if they're taking Austin out of this match, if they're taking Steve Austin out of this match, and again, it goes back to that idiot you were when you were a teenager and had no conception of the real world. It's like, which guys that I flick over to on Nitro that I really like, which one of them's coming? Which one of them's coming? Is it like Nash, Hall, Hogan, Sting, Goldberg? It's Goldberg, isn't it? This is Goldberg's thing, because it's going to be Goldberg in the car. Goldberg replaces him. It's going to be Goldberg versus Austin at the next pay-per-view. I was going absolutely crazy and bonkers. And it's Big Show. It's Big Show. They hated him. They didn't have any belief in him whatsoever. This is evident. Me, an undiscerning teenage idiot, knew, all right, they don't like him, and that's palpable, and that's why I don't like him either, because they're not giving me cause to believe in him. And it's Big Show. Hated it. Absolutely hated it.
In terms of the revelation of who it was...
Oh, the revelation of who knocked him over. I was just going to say, I felt like, when Homer Simpson sat with the XFL jersey on, that was me with my test gear on that night. I was like, here we go, it's test time. He's going to step up. Awful, really awful. And what was worse about it was, I think it was one of the... So Stephanie McMahon had just taken over creative from the brilliant Chris Kresge in 2000. And... I don't know how much exactly he had to do with it. That hit and run was all from a period of great change because Vince Russo...
Like the transition time, wasn't
Vince
it?
Russo just left for WCW. Chris Kresge was obviously just on the way in, but there was a lot of, like to-ing and fro-ing creatively at the time, and they had to come up with a way to write a character like Steve Austin for the better part of 10 months. You can't just have him get attacked by wrestlers because he's the hardest man in the world. He'd come back at the end of the night. So that was fair enough. I like the ambition of trying to rule out so many wrestlers to the point where... You've got a hot babyface, and they didn't know in November 1999 that Rikishi was going to be really hot in September 2000 at all. They had Billy Gunn lined up for it. He isn't there in the point when DX is sent out. He's this missing man. He's late to the show. They leave loads of clues that it's going to be Billy Gunn. And even early days, they're saying, oh, well, we think the driver was blonde, but then, we'll go back to that in 6 months. It was going to be Billy Gunn, right? So then he gets injured. He comes back at this point. Austin's a little bit paranoid, and he's lost faith and doesn't really want to work with Billy Gunn anymore. So like, oh, we got looking around. They say it was the Rock's rental car, but they've already said the driver's blonde. You see how they're getting caught in a lot of little traps to the point where Rikishi, to them, they're probably thinking, that's it. How creative is this? We can tie him to The Rock. We can tie him to the blonde hair. We can even say he was backstage at Survivor Series, but he doesn't appear on camera. All the pieces fit. This is perfect. But the payoff's still Rikishi. That's the only problem, is that the payoff's still Rikishi. You take a reasonably hot mid-card babyface, and you take away the one thing that people enjoy, which is his ability to dance. You make him a bad man when nobody wants to see that Rikishi. They just want to see him dance.
Aaron Rex Rikishi
Completely.
in front of our very eyes. You know what annoys me about this promo, the revelation, is that, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, because you are the robot. He's the robot. Rikishi's given it his whole Island Boys don't get a push patter. The Rock's wearing the WWF title in that segment, isn't he?
Yes. What they try and do is they try and suggest that because, had he not done it, The Rock wouldn't be champion there and then. That's the rationale.
He'd already been champion.
Of course he had. He'd won it 3 times before he was getting buried by racism. And then worse, and I love Steve Austin, but I'm no fan of this Steve Austin. So we talked a bit about Triple H dropping pedigrees earlier on. Austin was using this as an excuse to stun his way through the entire roster as if to announce that he was back, and he was kind of swinging it around a little bit, saying, all this fun you've been having, not anymore. Steve Austin's back. I'm going to take all your spots for trying to take mine. He buries Rikishi on 2 consecutive pay-per-views to the point where when Triple H steps in, it was a necessary evil. They had to get him in as and it was really transparent as well. It was sort of oh yeah, I know Rikishi did it, but I'm the mastermind. Forget about who run him over. It was all the mastermind. It was me like that. I'm wearing a black glove. See, it was me all along. But it was required because at least he was the best wrestler in the company, and at least you were going to get something meaningful because Austin had just crushed Rikishi in their matches. Legitimately injured him when he panged a cage door off his face. He leant him up against a little brick wall and tried to hit him with a truck. I think Rikishi
they had
landed
to
about...
stop him from being murdered.
Yeah, he's like,
I forgot about that.
1-1, you know, like it was just, he showed him no respect as a rival. So you almost think that, like, if Austin's gone back to work and we're like, lads, I'm not feeling it on Billy Gunn. And it was like, don't worry, we've got don't tell him. Just we'll tell him we'll get there in a few weeks. Triple H, start putting some blonde streaks in your hair so he thinks it's going to be you. Yeah, it was just, I don't think anyone was satisfied with it. And that's the worst thing is, like, if you imagine, like, the creative are behind it or the wrestlers are behind it, or at least internally they think we're going to make this work. I think the only person that would have been satisfied this would have been Rikishi. And then 2 or 3 Steve Austin-based concussions later probably put him off that. When the merchandise checks stopped coming in from the Too Cool T-shirts, he was probably thinking, what have I done? Why did I say yes to this?
We haven't even had time here, and I always think when you talked about that, it could be worse. You could have been the one stalking Sarah. So we haven't even got time to talk about DDP and that whole nonsense with the Undertaker.
I'm married to Kimberly Page, but I fancy your wife, Undertaker.
Absolute madness. After talking about these, how's your faith for the revelation of who sort of attempted to kill Roman Reigns?
I don't want to do the thing that some internet wrestling columnists do and say I called it, but there's a tidbit in this week's Wrestling Observer, if you're interested in spoilers, that reveals kind of the person I was leading towards, who is a star who doesn't have a match on the card. And I'm thinking, terrible journey, good destination, which is basically the whole story of SummerSlam 2019 for me.
Yeah, absolutely fair enough. Right, well, let us know your thoughts on the best wrestling whodunit in the comment section or on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. And watch there, you can follow all 3 of us. You can follow Michael Sidgwick at...
Not you, Big Show. Sidgwick.
He's got his new Netflix show to concentrate on. You can follow Michael Hamflett at...
Not you, Michael Hamflett.
You can follow me at Adam Wilbourn. You can follow us all at WhatCultureWWE. And make sure you subscribe to What Culture Wrestling for daily wrestling podcasts on either iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from. This has been Get the Table. My thanks to the Dadley Boyz. Thank you for watching, and we will see you soon.